The Galactic Military Academy on Vera 7 was not a place for the weak or the afraid. And Commander Yellows had seen enough horrors in his 200 years of service to fill a dozen nightmares. But nothing had ever made his scales turn pale like the creature in Containment Block 7. She was called a Varax. And she was the reason 3 colonial expeditions had vanished without a single distress signal. The reason an entire moon had been declared forbidden space. The reason that even the most battle-hardened soldiers spoke in whispers when her species was mentioned. The Academy had spent 40 years trying to capture one alive. And 17 research teams had died in the attempt before they finally succeeded in bringing her here. Yellow stood before the observation window and watched her pace inside her cell. 800 pounds of armored plates and coiled muscle moving with a grace that seemed impossible for something so massive. 6 limbs that ended in claws, sharp enough to cut through starship hulls. And eyes that held an intelligence far beyond what any predator should possess. She was beautiful in the way that death was beautiful. Perfect and terrible, and utterly without mercy. She has not eaten in 6 cycles, Dr. Miveth said beside him. A voice barely above a whisper, as if she feared the creature might hear them through 3 meters of reinforced barrier. Yellows did not take his eyes off the Varax as he answered. I am aware. She has not attacked the feeding drones either, Commander. And that is what concerns me most. He understood her fear because he shared it. For a hungry predator that refused to eat was a predator that was planning something, waiting for something. And the Varax had been doing nothing but waiting for 3 months now. 3 months since they had taken her cubs. The decision had come from the High Council itself. 2 juvenile Varax, small enough to hold in a single arm, but already showing the same deadly potential as their mother. And the scientists had wanted to study them in isolation to understand how such perfect killers were made. They had moved the cubs to sublevel 9 in the middle of the night cycle. And the mother had somehow known the moment they were gone. She had killed 11 personnel before the security teams managed to subdue her with enough sedative to drop a starship crew. And when she woke up in her reinforced cell, something in her eyes had changed. She stopped hunting, stopped eating, stopped doing anything except watching the barriers with a patience that made Yellows feel like prey. She knows, Dr. Miveth continued, her scales rippling with nervous energy. She knows her cubs are somewhere, in this facility, and she is waiting for her chance to find them. The containment protocols are the strongest we have ever designed, Yellows said. But even he could hear the doubt in his own voice. She cannot break through, Dr. Miveth turned to look at him with eyes that held no comfort. Commander, we said the same thing about the transport ship that brought her here. And she killed 6 guards before we reached orbit. We said the same thing about the initial holding cell. And she found a weakness in the energy grid within 2 days. She paused and looked back at the Varax, who had stopped pacing and was now staring directly at the observation window, as if she could see them through the one-way glass. Every barrier we have built. She has learned to break every trap we have set. She has learned to avoid. She is not just a predator. Commander, she is a problem solver. And right now she is solving the problem of how to reach her children. Yellows felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the temperature controls, what neither of them knew. What no one in the upper levels of the Academy knew was that Sublevel 9 had experienced what the official reports called a containment incident. Exactly 14 days ago, the cubs had escaped. The automated systems had failed during a routine power transfer. And for exactly 4 minutes and 17 seconds, the holding cell doors had opened. And 2 juvenile Varax had slipped into the ventilation network before anyone realized what had happened. The search teams had found nothing. The scanner sweeps had detected nothing. And the incident had been classified and buried under 17 layers of bureaucratic silence because no one wanted to admit. that they had lost the only juvenile specimens of the deadliest species. In the galaxy, the cubs could be anywhere in the facility by now, starving in some forgotten maintenance shaft or hiding in the darkness of the lower levels. And no one was looking for them, because no one wanted to face the consequences of admitting they were gone. But someone had found them, someone had stumbled upon two frightened babies, crying in a ventilation shaft on the research level, their bioluminescent markings dim with dehydration and their small bodies shaking with hunger and fear. Someone had looked at two juvenile apex predators, creatures that could already kill most species with a single swipe of their tiny claws, and had felt something that defied all logic and all survival instinct. Someone had taken them home, and in her cell 7 levels above. The Vorak suddenly stopped staring at the observation window and turned her head toward the floor, her nostrils flaring as she caught a scent that should not have been possible through all the atmospheric filters and containment barriers. Her cubs were alive. She could not smell them exactly, could not pinpoint their location through all the interference, but she could feel something that went beyond physical senses, a connection that the scientists had never understood and never would. Her children were alive, and they were not afraid, and somehow that made everything worse because it meant someone had taken them. Someone was keeping them, and she did not know if that someone was friend or enemy. The Varax lowered her massive body to the floor and pressed her head against the cold metal, listening to vibrations that traveled through the structure of the facility itself, mapping the space around her, learning the patterns of movement and energy flow that would tell her where the weaknesses were. She had been patient for 3 months. She could be patient a little longer, but when the time came, when she finally found the crack in their defenses that she knew existed, nothing in this galaxy would stop her from reaching her cubs. Commander Yellows watched her settle into stillness and felt his scales grow even paler. "Increase security rotation to every 2 hours," he ordered. "And I want constant monitoring of all containment systems," Dr. Miveth nodded. But they both knew it would not be enough. Nothing would be enough. The deadliest predator in known space was waiting. And sooner or later, she would stop waiting and start hunting, and when that happened, the Academy would learn what 40 years of research had failed to teach them, that some creatures were never meant to be caged, and some mothers would burn down the stars themselves to find their children. Tierra Elena Vasquez had been on Vera 7 for 3 years, and in all that time she had never once been trusted with anything important. She worked in the Xenobiology Archives, a fancy title for a job that mostly involved organizing old research files and making sure the digital storage systems did not crash. And she had grown used to the looks that other species gave her when she walked through the corridors. Humans had only joined Galactic Society 50 years ago, and most aliens still did not know what to make of them. The Tithrani thought humans were too aggressive, always ready to fight even when fighting made no sense. The Veleth thought humans were too curious, always asking questions and poking into things that should be left alone. And the Morrow thought humans were simply too much of everything, too loud and too emotional and too unpredictable to ever be trusted with serious work. So Elena had learned to keep her head down and do her job and not ask why she had been assigned to the archives instead of the research labs where her doctorate in xenobiology should have placed her. She had learned to smile politely when her colleagues talked over her and to nod patiently when supervisors explained things she already knew. And she had learned to find small joys in the quiet moments when she was alone with her work and her thoughts. That was how she found the cubs. It was late in the night cycle, and Elena had stayed behind to finish cataloging a shipment of specimens from the outer colonies. Boring work that no one else wanted to do, but that someone had to complete before the morning review. She had been walking back to her quarters through the maintenance corridors because they were faster and quieter than the main hallways when she heard the sound. It was a small sound, barely audible over the hum of the ventilation systems. But something about it made Elena stop and listen. It sounded like crying, not human crying. Not exactly, but something close enough to trigger an instinct that ran deeper than logic or training. Something that made her heart ache with a recognition she could not explain. She followed the sound to a ventilation shaft near the floor, and when she pulled back the grating, two pairs of eyes looked up at her from the darkness. They were small, no bigger than house cats, with armored plates that had not yet hardened into the impenetrable shells of adults, and bioluminescent markings that flickered weakly. Along their spines, Elena knew what they were, and every protocol she had ever learned screamed at her to call security, to report the escaped specimens, to get as far away as possible from two creatures that could already kill most species with a single swipe of their claws. But they were crying. They were hungry and thirsty and terrified, pressed together in the darkness of a ventilation shaft with no mother to protect them and no food to sustain them. And something in Elena's chest cracked open at the sight of them. She reached into the shaft. The first cub flinched away from her hand, its tiny claws extending in a threat display that should have sent her running. But the second one was too weak to even move, its markings so dim that Elena could barely see them in the shadows. "It is okay," she whispered, knowing they could not understand her words, but hoping they could understand her tone. "I am not going to hurt you, I promise. I just want to help." She picked up the weaker cub first, cradling it against her chest like she had seen her mother do with injured animals back on Earth. And after a moment, the other one crept forward and pressed against her arm. Too exhausted to fight anymore, Elena carried them back to her quarters. And she did not call security, and she did not report the incident. And she did not think about what would happen if anyone found out what she had done. For 2 weeks, she lived a double life. During the day, she went to her job in the archives and smiled at her colleagues and pretended nothing had changed. But at night, she smuggled nutrient paste from the commissary and mixed it with protein supplements and fed 2 growing cubs who should have been her enemies. She named them Ash and Ember, and she learned their sounds. The chirp that meant hungry came most often in the early morning, and Elena would wake to find them both staring at her with expectant eyes that made her laugh despite the danger. The rumble that meant safe was a low vibration in their chests that they made when she held them close, and the high-pitched keen that meant scared came whenever a loud noise echoed through the walls. They should not have trusted her, and she should not have loved them, but somehow both things happened anyway. Elena discovered that they liked to sleep pressed against her warmth. Their small bodies curled into the curve of her neck, and their armored plates surprisingly soft against her skin. And she discovered that they made a purring sound when she scratched behind their ear ridges. And she discovered that they followed her around her quarters like ducklings following their mother. She told herself she was just keeping them alive until she figured out what to do, until she found a way to return them somewhere safe without getting herself arrested or worse. But deep down, she knew the truth. She had already adopted them. They were hers now. These 2 deadly children that the galaxy feared. And she would protect them the way she would protect any baby that needed her, with everything she had and everything she was. On the 15th night, the alarm started screaming. Elena had been reading in bed with Ash curled against her stomach and Ember draped across her shoulders when the red lights began flashing, and the evacuation orders flooded every speaker. In the facility, she grabbed her datapad and pulled up the emergency channel, and her blood went cold when she saw the words scrolling across the screen: containment breach in Block 7. All personnel evacuate to designated safe zones. Deadly specimen loose in facility. Repeat. Deadly specimen loose Block 7. The mother Elena looked down at Ash and Ember, at their suddenly alert eyes and their raised ear ridges, and she understood with terrible clarity what was about to happen. Their mother had escaped, and she was coming for them. And nothing in this facility was going to stop her. Elena picked up both cubs and held them against her chest. And for a moment she allowed herself to feel the fear that she had been pushing away for 2 weeks. The knowledge that she had made a choice that might cost her everything. Then she pushed the fear down and started thinking she could not run. Not with 2 cubs that the security forces would recognize on sight, and she could not hide. Not from a mother who could track her children across a galaxy. There was only one thing she could do. She could wait, and when the moment came, she could hope that 2 weeks of love and care and midnight feedings would be enough to convince a mother that she was not the enemy. It was a foolish hope. The kind of hope that only a human would hold on to in the face of impossible odds. But Elena had never learned how to stop hoping. So she sat on her bed with Ash and Ember in her arms. And she waited for the deadliest creature in the galaxy to come and find them. The Varax found her weakness at 3 hours past midnight, when the power grid flickered during a routine transfer between generator cycles. It was a small flicker, barely a heartbeat of reduced energy, but it was enough. She hit the containment barrier at exactly the right moment. When the force field was running at 92% instead of 100, and the impact that should have thrown her back instead created a crack in the energy matrix that spread like lightning through glass. The alarms started screaming 1 second later. But by then she was already through. The first guard died before he could raise his weapon, and the second died trying to run. And the third managed to fire a single plasma burst that scorched across her armor plates, but did nothing to slow her down. She moved through the corridors like death itself had taken physical form. 800 pounds of muscle and rage, and maternal fury that had been building for 3 months of captivity and separation. The Academy had taken her children. Now the Academy would pay Commander Yellows. Watch the carnage unfold from the emergency bunker. His scales so pale they were almost white, and the numbers on his screen climbed higher with every passing. Minute 12 dead in the first 5 minutes, 23 dead in the first 15, 47 dead by the end of the first hour. How is she tracking them? He demanded, his voice cracking with a fear he could no longer hide. We have run the atmospheric scrubbers at maximum. We have flooded the corridors with masking agents. There should be no scent trail to follow. Dr. Mivith stood beside him, her eyes fixed on the tactical display that showed the Varax moving through the facility with terrifying purpose. And when she spoke, her voice was hollow with understanding. She is not tracking a scent. Commander, she is tracking absence. Yellows turned to look at her, and the confusion on his face would have been almost comical under different circumstances. What do you mean? I mean, she knows where her cubs are not, Dr. Mivith explained. She is not following a trail. She is eliminating possibilities. Every sector she clears is a sector where they cannot be hiding. Every level she searches is a level she can cross off her mental map. She paused and watched the red dot on the display tier through another security checkpoint. She is thinking. Commander, she is planning and learning and adapting. And she is getting faster with every engagement, because she's learning which weapons can hurt her, and which are merely painful. The Varax had reached Sector 8, and the security teams there had set up a kill zone with overlapping fields of fire and 3 different types of containment measures. She went through them in less than 2 minutes. The tactical display showed her pause for a pause moment at an intersection, her massive head swinging back and forth as she tested the air. And then she turned and headed toward the residential levels. She has narrowed it down, Dr. Mivith whispered. She knows they are in the living quarters now. Yellows grabbed the communication panel and shouted evacuation orders that should have been given an hour ago. But even as he spoke, he knew it would not be enough. Knew that the Varax was moving faster than any evacuation protocol could match species that had conquered star systems, fled screaming through the corridors as the creature came for them. Not because she wanted to kill them, but because they were in her way. Obstacles between her and her children that needed to be removed. A Tithrani security chief tried to make a stand at the entrance to Level 4. And the Varax broke through his barricade like it was made of paper. A Vela scientist attempted to seal a blast door, and she tore it from its frame before it could fully close. A Morrow engineer fired an experimental weapon that should have been able to stop a charging warship. And the Varax absorbed the hit and kept coming with nothing but a new scar across her armored shoulder. Nothing could stop her. Nothing could slow her down. She was 3 floors away from the residential quarters now, and the screaming ahead of her was starting to fade as the last of the personnel managed to reach the evacuation points. 2 floors. The emergency lights flickered and died in her wake, torn apart by passing claws or crushed under massive feet. And the darkness that followed her was absolute. 1 floor. Commander Yellows watched the red dot on his display reach the final corridor before the residential section, and he felt something in his chest that might have been hope when he saw that the area ahead was completely empty. Everyone had evacuated. Everyone had escaped. The Cubs were not there, and the Varax would find nothing but empty rooms and cold beds. And maybe that would be enough to make her pause, to make her reconsider. To give them time. To the red dot stopped. Yellows leaned forward, his breath caught in his throat, and watched as the Varax stood motionless at the end of the corridor for 1 second, then 2, then 5. What is she doing? He demanded. Dr. Miveth pulled up the camera feed from that section, and for a long moment, neither of them could understand what they were seeing. The corridor was not empty. A single figure stood at the far end, small and soft and utterly defenseless. A human female with dark hair and terrified eyes, holding something against her chest. 2 somethings. 2 small somethings with armored plates and bioluminescent markings that glowed bright with recognition. Oh no. Dr. Miveth breathed. The Cubs. Someone had found. The Cubs. Someone had kept them hidden for 2 weeks while the security forces searched, and the mother raged, and the academy pretended nothing had gone wrong. Someone was standing in front of the deadliest creature in the galaxy with nothing but 2 stolen children and the insane courage that only humans seem to possess. Get teams down there now. Yellow shouted. Full weapons, full armor, everything we have. But even as he gave the orders, he knew they would be too late. The Varax had found her Cubs, and she had found them with a human. What happened next would determine whether Elena Vasquez lived or died. And there was nothing anyone else could do but watch. Elena did not run. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to flee, to hide, to do anything except stand motionless in the middle of a corridor while 800 pounds of armored death stared at her. From 50 meters away, she could see the blood on those claws, could see the gouges in that armored hide where plasma fire had scored but failed to penetrate, could see the intelligence in those obsidian eyes that was already calculating how many steps it would take to close the distance between them. She was going to die here, and some distant part of her brain had already accepted that fact. But she did not run because running would not save her, and because Ash and Ember were pressed against her chest, making sounds she had never heard them make before. They were not screaming. They were not crying with fear like they had been when she found them in the ventilation shaft 2 weeks ago. They were chirping, a high, rapid sound full of excitement and recognition, and they were squirming in her arms, not to escape, but to get closer to the creature. At the end of the hall, they were calling for their mother. Elena felt tears running down her face as she finally understood what was happening, as she finally realized that these 2 babies she had loved and fed and protected for 2 weeks had never forgotten where they came from. They knew that shape in the darkness. They knew those eyes and that scent, and that massive silhouette that blocked out the emergency lights. They knew their mother had come for them. The Varax charged. Elena closed her eyes because she could not bear to watch her own death coming. But she did not drop the cubs, and she did not turn away. And the last thing she expected was for everything to suddenly go silent. She opened her eyes. The Varax had stopped 3 meters away, close enough that Elena could feel the heat radiating from that enormous body, close enough that she could see her own terrified reflection in those dark eyes, close enough that a single swipe of those bloody claws would end her life before she could even think about screaming. But the creature was not attacking. She was staring at Elena with an expression that transcended species, a look of confusion and assessment, and something that might have been wonder. Her massive head tilted to one side as she tried to understand what she was seeing. Elena understood because she had spent 2 weeks learning to read the body language of 2 small cubs. And this mother was asking the same questions her children would have asked. Why do my babies smell like you? Why are they fat and healthy when they should be starving? Why are they pressing toward you instead of trying to reach me? Why are they not afraid? Ash made a sound Elena had never heard before, a deep rumble that seemed to vibrate through her entire body, and Ember answered with the same sound. And then both cubs turned their heads to look at their mother and made the sound again. Elena did not know what it meant, but she could guess safe. They were saying she is safe. She kept us warm and fed us and held us when we were scared, and she is safe. The Varax went absolutely still. And for a long, terrible moment, Elena thought she had misread everything. Thought that maternal instinct would override whatever message the cubs were trying to send. Thought that she was about to die anyway, despite the impossible hope that had kept her standing here. Then, slowly, impossibly, the Varax lowered her claws to the floor. Elena was shaking so hard she could barely stand, tears streaming down her face and her heart pounding so loud she was sure the creature could hear it. But she made herself move anyway. She held out the cubs. "They are beautiful," she said, her voice breaking on every word. "I am sorry. I am so sorry they took them from you. I found them in a ventilation shaft, and they were starving and scared, and I could not just leave them there. I could not let them die." She was crying openly now, ugly sobs that shook her whole body, and she could not understand why she was apologizing to a creature that had just slaughtered its way through a military installation. But it felt like the right thing to do. "I tried to take care of them," she continued. "I fed them and kept them warm, and I know I had no right. I know they were not mine to keep, but I loved them. I loved them so much, and I am so sorry." The cubs chirped and squirmed and reached their small claws toward their mother. And Elena loosened her grip so they could go to her if they wanted to. They did not go. Instead, they pressed closer to Elena, their small bodies wedged into the space between her arms and her chest. And they looked at their mother with eyes that held no fear at all. "She is Pack." Those eyes seemed to say, "She is ours now." The Varax made a sound that Elena had never heard in any recording or research document. A low, keening note that seemed to hold 1,000 years of loneliness and loss and love. Then that massive head lowered, and the deadliest predator in the galaxy pressed her face against Elena's trembling hands. The touch was gentle, impossibly gentle for something with so much power. And Elena felt the warm breath wash over her skin as the Varax inhaled her scent. As she catalogued every detail of this strange, soft creature who had done what no other being in the universe would have done, she had taken in 2 orphan predators and made them her own. She had loved what everyone else feared, and somehow, against all logic and all instinct and all the laws of nature that said predators and prey could never coexist, she had convinced 2 cubs that a human could be trusted. The Varax pulled back and looked at Elena with new eyes. And what Elena saw in that gaze was not hunger or threat, or the cold calculation of a killer. It was recognition. It was acceptance. It was the ancient acknowledgement of one mother to another. You kept my children alive. You are back now too. Elena laughed through her tears. A broken sound that held relief and joy and a dozen other emotions she could not name. And she reached out with one shaking hand to touch the armored plates of the Varax's face. The creature let her, and somewhere in the emergency bunker 7 levels above, Commander Yellows watched the security feed with his mouth hanging open and no words left to describe what he was. Seeing the human had done the impossible. She had tamed the deadliest creature in the galaxy with nothing but kindness and love, and the Varax, who had killed 47 people in her desperate search for her children, stood gentle as a lamb before the woman who had saved them. The security footage was reviewed by the Galactic Council 3 weeks later, and not a single member could believe what they were seeing. Commander Yellows stood before them in the great chamber on the central world and explained what had happened, his voice steady despite the tremor in his scales. And when he finished, the silence stretched for a very long time. "You are telling us," the tiny high speaker finally said, "that a human female stopped the Varax without weapons or force or any form of containment technology?" "Yes." "High speaker, you are telling us that she did this by caring for the creature's offspring for 2 weeks, despite the obvious danger to herself?" "Yes." "High speaker, and you are telling us that the Varax, after killing 47 personnel in her escape, chose to protect this human rather than harm her?" Yellows took a deep breath and answered the only way he could. The Varax followed Dia Vasquez back to her quarters after their encounter in the corridor, and she remained there for 6 hours while our teams debated what to do. During that time, she curled her body around the human's sleeping pod, with the cubs nestled between them, and she could not threaten or harm anyone who came near. The chamber erupted in murmurs and whispers, 1,000 voices speaking at once in a dozen different languages. And Yellows waited for the noise to die down before he continued. When our armored response units finally breached the door, the Varax positioned herself between them and Dr. Vasquez, and it was clear to everyone present that she would fight to the death to protect the human if necessary. He paused and let that sink in. Dr. Vasquez told us to put our weapons down. She said the Varax was not the monster, that we were the ones who had taken her children, and that she had only been trying to get them back. And when she spoke, the Varax watched her with what I can only describe as trust. The high speaker leaned forward, her ancient eyes sharp with interest. "What happened then?" "Commander, Dr. Vasquez negotiated a peaceful resolution. She convinced us to lower our weapons, and she convinced the Varax to stand down. And together, they walked out of that room without a single additional casualty." The report that followed changed everything. Teams of xenobiologists and behavioral scientists descended on Vara 7 to study what had happened, and their findings were compiled into a document that would eventually be distributed to every species in the Galactic Alliance, humans. It turned out, possessed an ability that no other known species shared. They could bond with anything. It was not a learned behavior or a cultural trait or a survival strategy that could be explained by evolutionary pressure. It was something built into the very core of their biology, a pack instinct so powerful and so undiscriminating that they would adopt predators and prey alike without hesitation. They would take in creatures that evolution had designed. To kill them and make those creatures family, they would fight and die for beings they had no logical reason to protect. They would love the unlovable and trust the untrustworthy, and somehow, against all odds, they would be loved and trusted in return. Dr. Elena Vasquez became the subject of intense scientific interest, though she refused most requests for interviews and studies. And when the council asked her why she had risked her life for 2 juvenile apex predators, she gave an answer that baffled most of the alien delegates. They were babies, she said simply. They were hungry, and scared and alone, and I could not just leave them there. It did not matter what species they were or what they might become. In that moment, they were just children who needed help, and I was the only one who could give it. The concept seemed almost too simple to be true, but the evidence was undeniable. Humans had domesticated wolves and turned them into loyal companions. They had tamed horses and elephants, and even some of the most dangerous creatures on their homeworld. And they had done it not through force or dominance, but through something far more powerful. They had done it through love. The Varax was eventually released to a protected sanctuary world far from any inhabited systems, her cubs with her, and a team of human specialists was assigned to help her adjust to her new environment. But she refused to leave until Elena came to say goodbye. The morning of the departure, Elena walked into the holding area where the Varax waited, and the creature rose to her feet with a grace that still made Elena's breath catch in her throat. Ash and Ember bounded over immediately, chirping with the excitement of cubs who had not yet learned to fear anything because they had never needed to. And Elena knelt down to gather them in her arms one last time. "You are going to be so happy there," she whispered against their armored plates. "Open spaces and fresh air and all the room you need to run and grow. And your mother will teach you everything you need to know." The cubs made the sound that meant safe, and Elena had to close her eyes against the tears. She had known this day was coming, had known from the beginning that she could not keep them forever. But knowing did not make the goodbye any easier. A shadow fell over her, and Elena looked up to find the Varax standing directly above her. Those obsidian eyes filled with an emotion that transcended species. "Take care of them," Elena said, her voice cracking. "They like to sleep pressed against something warm. And Ember gets scared when there are loud noises, and Ash is always hungry. Always. No matter how much you feed him." She was rambling because she did not know what else to say, because there were no words in any language for this impossible connection they had built. And she felt foolish until the Varax lowered her massive head and pressed it gently against Elena's chest. The touch was brief, barely a moment of contact, but Elena felt the rumble that passed between them safe. It said, "You are Pack. You will always be Pack." And when the Varax finally pulled away and walked toward the transport that would carry her to freedom, she paused at the threshold and looked back. And the sound she made was recorded and analyzed and filed under a new category in the Galactic Xenolinguistics database. Grief at separation from Pack Bond. Elena stood in that holding area long after the transport was gone, tears streaming down her face and her arms empty for the first time in weeks. And she thought about everything that had happened and everything it meant. Humans, the galaxy was learning, did not just survive their universe. They made families of it. They saw predators and prey and monsters and miracles. And instead of running or fighting, they opened their arms and said, "Welcome. You belong here too." It was not logical, and it was not safe, and it was certainly not what any sensible species would do. But it was human, and sometimes, against all logic and all expectation and all the laws of nature that said such things should never happen. The monsters loved them back. 50 years from now, the Academy on Vareth 7 would be replaced by a different kind of institution, one that studied cooperation instead of containment, one that sought to understand instead of control. And it would be called the Vasquez Center for Interspecies Relations, and on a sanctuary world far away, a mother Varax would teach her cubs about the strange soft creature who had saved them, and they would pass that story down to their own cubs, and their cubs after that. The human who was not afraid, the human who loved them first, the human who proved that even the deadliest predators in the galaxy could recognize kindness when they saw it. And somewhere in that sanctuary, in a place of honor that no other species had ever been allowed to occupy, there was a small shrine containing a single item that Elena had given to the cubs before she said goodbye. a blanket from her sleeping pod. Still carrying her scent, the Verax kept it there because it reminded her of Pac and because some bonds, once formed, were never truly broken.